Hello everyone and welcome to Handmade here, the show where we code a complete game live on stream. We are going to do some editing features today. Essentially the problem that we have at the moment is that we added some stuff to our sort of art asset format that is not something that we really have any way to input. So basically, like, we have information we need for different sprite pieces, things that are supposed to snap together. And we now have ways of describing how they snap together, but we don't have any way of actually ever specifying any of that. And we could just make a text file format that we then have to edit by hand. But rather than doing that, what I would rather do is make it so that there is a way to edit it inside the game that then I can just hit save and it just writes the text file for me. Because I don't really ever want to edit the text file. I mean, I'd like to have a text file there so I can just look at it and verify that it's correct. And sometimes again, if you don't have a lot of time to write tools, text files are kind of your friend because you can use like diff utilities and stuff on them, and source code control knows how to merge them, for example. So you can leverage a lot of stuff there if you use a text file format. So I kind of do like the idea of having a text file format to write to. I just don't want to actually have to make them by hand because I think that would just be sort of annoying and take a long time. And so that's really all I wanted to do this weekend, is make something that I can use to edit that information. And it's not particularly hard code, it's just a lot of code, because you gotta write something that writes text files and reads them, and I gotta write something that edits this stuff and allows to save. It's just a lot of code, right? So it's gonna take us a little while to do, but it's not particularly hard code. It's not code that it's gonna bend your mind or anything, but it isn't small typically. It actually takes a bit of typing. So if you remember correctly, the point of this was just for example, we had some cats we loaded in, and we have different pieces. There's cat heads and cat bodies, and we wanted the cat heads and the cat bodies to both, to be able to sort of specify snap points that would just stick on. And so right now what we get if we try to put a cat in there, and again, scale was also part of this, right? We just get a cat of an arbitrary size, and we have no way to adjust the size in game, right? It's just whatever numbers we randomly picked. So we have that problem. The other problem we have is that they're not snapped together. The head doesn't go on the body at all. So it's just ridiculous and totally not what we want. And so what we want to be able to do, we wrote something here where we can pick stuff pretty easily. What we'd like to be able to do is be able to click here and bring up some information where I can just edit that stuff. What is the scale of this cat? So I can set it to something reasonable. And how do the pieces of the cat snap together to create an actual correctly formed cat? This is not hard. Like I said before, we're just talking about basically implementing some floating point values in an editable window. It just takes a long time because we don't have anything like that. But we can borrow our debug code, which sort of had some stuff for doing this. We can borrow our debug code and kind of use that so we don't have to re-implement everything. But we will have to do some typing. Okay, so how do we edit this stuff? Well, what I would like to do is have some way, because what's actually happening in that code that we wrote for picking last week is we know when we exit this routine, we actually have information about who was selected by the mouse cursor, right? So when we went through here, we already did the work to figure out who's being picked, and we have that piece of information. So really what we want here is a way of providing that to some system that can do something with it, right? So if we have a pick where it says hey, this is the entity, and this is the piece of the entity that was being picked or whatever, how do we get that out of here, right? And so that's something that I would like to address. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce some pretty simple stuff here. Inside world mode is one place we could put it, but I don't love that. The reason I don't love that is because if you think about what's happening here, is basically what we're editing is we're not editing entities, because we're never actually editing entities. If you look at something like, for example, since John was on the stream earlier, if you look at games like what John makes, Braid and The Witness, The way those work is the designer makes entities and they place entities in the world, right? So the core unit of editing is an entity. That is what you would be editing. And so what we would normally think about our editing system being built around is editing an entity specifically, right? And so it would make a lot of sense if we were in one of those engines to do it that way. And that is how those engines work. You edit entities. However, in our engine, the designer never places any entities. We don't have that concept. The generator places them, and it does whatever it wants, right? So it's creating entities all over the place. It's parametrically determining their values. And so us editing an entity in our game makes no sense. It's not a designery game in that way. The designer, if we had one, would be working on the generator, not on the entities, right? And so what we're really editing here, and the parameters we're actually concerned with, are actually parameters of the art assets. We don't really have a lot of need to edit parameters of entities because those have to be edited in the generator, and I don't really know how you would make an interface for editing that through entities. You'd have to do something really crazy like tag the route that everything went through the generator and have a really cool edit system that like flowed back to that. I could imagine doing that if this was a project I was spending full time on every day. I'm not going to even try to do that at 2 hours a day on weekends only, right? Because that's like a huge, it sounds cool, it's a little bit far afield, right? So we're going to be editing that generator mostly by hand, and if we do have an interface for it, it's going to be an interface that goes directly to the generator. It's not going to try to reverse through it. So we're editing mostly art assets, and the parameters we're editing are artistic parameters that go onto the art assets themselves. What that means is that we don't really want our editing system to be restricted to entities, because why should it be? Maybe we've got some interface stuff in the metagame, maybe the cutscenes, for example, anything like that. If we want to be able to specify information to those art assets, they're not entities. There's no entities there, right? And we don't really want to have to introduce entities into that system for no reason, when really the only thing we're trying to edit is art assets. So really what we want to think about here is how do we expose editing of art assets, not of entities, because those are two different things, and we really just don't have a game where entities can be edited. They just can't be edited, right? The thing that has to be edited is the generator's parameters, and that would be a different interface, which we might make at some point for fine-tuning or whatever, but it's a different kind of thing. So what we want to do here is we want to focus on the fact that assets are the things that are being edited, and we want to kind of put this code in something that's going to be asset editing based. So I think what that's going to mean is it's going to be something that lives at a pretty high level. It's going to be something that lives and talks to the asset system more directly and doesn't really go through the game code. It's more the game code telling it what was selected is about it, right? So I think what's going to happen here is we're going to have something where, for example, we've got this switch statement here. And what this switch statement does is it says, what kind of game mode are we running? What do we need to do here? Let's go ahead and update the title screen, update the render cutscene, update the world, whatever it is that we're running. That's what we're going to do. And what I'd like to see happen here is to expand our notion of what's going on in this particular context to include an overriding editor that sits above everything in the game. Doesn't matter what mode you're in, you can still propagate information out to the editor and have it edit asynchronous of, well, not asynchronous of, I should say edit irrespective of who is the actual arbiter of what goes on the screen and not. So what I'd like to see here is inside the game state, right, which is kind of the overriding thing that controls that, not specific to which game mode you're actually running. I would like to have that game state be the thing that checks this information, right? So in here, I want to have something that's sort of like, asset editor or something like this, or just like in-game editor, something like that. You know what I'm talking about? So I want to have something here that's just an in-game editor thing. And that in-game editor thing is going to be something that allows me to communicate this information in and out, right? So we're just going to make a file, and I'm going to dump this stuff into that file, and we're going to go from there. So here's in-game editor. And again, one of the things that I might do, this would go in the debug system if I were making this game for me. I'm not making this game for me, I'm making this game for you. And as a result, what that means, why can I not save this? Handmade in game editor.cpp. There we go. Since I'm making it for other people substantively to learn and work in, it means that things like being able to edit the art assets are going to probably ship in the actual release version of the game. That's a little atypical. It's not 100% atypical because some games come with editors. In fact, I mentioned Braid. Braid came with an editor on the PC. If I remember correctly, you could pop up like John's interface for editing, you know, things in the world, and you could edit them. That's my recollection anyway. I could be wrong about that. So it had, like the PC version had an editor. I think it didn't ship maybe necessarily, I don't know if it necessarily shipped immediately with the game, but I think it did because I think the PC version was also delayed because it was Xbox exclusive or something, the original one. I don't even remember. I don't remember anything about that, but I just remember I think the PC version could do that. So it's not out of the ordinary for a game to include an editor. It's just not necessarily how I would normally do things. I don't normally ship games with editors. I mean, I don't normally ship games. I normally just ship tech. So I don't know. But point being, normally it's not something I would consider. I'd consider them going the debug system. So anyway, inside here, if I imagine what's going to go in here, I would say, okay, there's going to be an in-game editor. And what I want to do is go write some code that does in-game editing. I'm going to shove the things it needs to edit into here. But I know that one of them very clearly is going to be like what kind of bitmap editor or what kind of what's the word I'm looking for? What kind of art asset am I editing? You know, which art asset am I actually looking at, and which art asset am I editing here? So if I go into HHA edit, for example, I'm not sorry, HHA edit, the asset system, right? We know that inside here we've got like a set of loaded assets, and there's information about those assets in here, right? And when we go to match against assets, we can do stuff in this system where we go through and we do various things. We usually are able to pull out things like a bitmap ID and say, look, this is the bitmap ID I'm using, and then it will go and try to edit that bitmap ID, right? So what we want to be able to do here is respect the fact that all of our assets are loaded at any given time. There's just an asset array, and I should be able to talk about an asset in that asset array, and I want to edit that particular asset. If I did that, I would be able to get back to one of these. That asset has a bunch of information in it, including the original file format information from whence it came. That means that the header itself will be in there, right? And the HHA asset structure will actually be there. That's one of these. And what you can see is that has all the information I need actually in order to edit it. It'll say what type it is, and it's got the information for the bitmap sound or font baked right in there. The only thing it doesn't tell me is how to immediately write it back out. But if I was starting with one of these structures to begin with, I have the file index and which asset it was inside that file, which means I can also write it back to disk anytime I want. This puts me in a great position to make this be the foundational element of our editing. So what I'm going to do here is say, all right, look, let's just say, we'll hypothetically say in a hypothetical way with hypotheses, let's just say that we had some way of recording a set of art assets that we may want to edit. Okay? I'm just going to say that hypothetically. So if I say I have an edited, editable asset or something here, right? And I want to say, look, this particular asset index is something that I'm recording that should be edited. And maybe I put in there as well sort of I don't really want to call it a priority. It's not a priority. It's more like a z-depth. It's more like a sorting value. So I want to be able to say, look, a lot of times there's going to be a preference to what is probably edited. So for example, if I hit test things in the world and I look at all the things that I've hit tested, I may want to say one way or another that things that are far from the camera are less likely to be the thing that you were trying to edit than things that are in the camera. Now, it's not 100% true, right? Because like, let's take this scenario, for example. I might mouse over this thing and who knows, maybe I wanted to edit the body, not the head, right? Or maybe I wanted to edit the square this thing was standing on, but it's big and it's fat and I can't get at it, right? So it's not a given that I want to edit the closest thing to the cursor. It's just more likely. So I want to provide some kind of an information there that's like a sort key, right? It's just saying, look, I'm going to give you some information. I'm going to prefer things, let's just say here that closer to 0 is better. Let's just say that because that's what I want to say, and I'm going to say it, so I just said it. Closer to 0 is better, so we're basically going to say that like anything that's greater than 0 decreases your chance as you go out and makes it more likely to be ignored. And maybe I'll say that less than 0 is discarded, right? So when you provide these things, I want you to be giving me things that are above 0, and the further above 0, the further they are. If they're lower than 0, those are just discarded. I don't know why. I just want to do that. That's what I'm a programmer. I'm allowed to make arbitrary decisions. And the CPU has to obey me. That's just how it goes. So what I want to do here is create a notion of an editable like asset group. And in here, I want to track some number of these. So I might say there's an asset count, and I might say that there's some number of these assets, right, that I'm looking at. And each one of those editable assets, let's say maybe there's 16 of them or something like this. You know, when I do one of these editable asset groups, maybe I have something, maybe I have some idea of like when I grab these things up, what I'm looking for, and maybe I want to discard them. I could add a filter in here, for example, as well. But we'll see. We'll see how we want to do that. So anyway, in the in-game editor, what I want to do here is I want to have an editable asset group, and I want this to be the current group, right? And I'm going to do something like, I'm going to use my sort of standard trick that I like to use, which is active and hot. And these two things are a little bit different. The active group is the thing that I'm actually editing. The hot group is the one that's like under the cursor right now, which may not really be something I'm looking at if I'm in the middle of an edit operation, or it might be if I am in the middle of an edit. If I'm not in the middle of an edit operation, I'm just like picking entities, right? So this is the structure that I want to provide. And then what I want to do is I want to be able to gather these, and then I want to be able to edit these. Depending on the circumstances, you know, what's going on there, I want to be able to do different things. So this editable asset group probably wants to bundle up into an editable query or something like this, like editable hit test or something like this. And what I want to do here is say that that editable hit test is going to have, you know, an idea of what the desk group is that it's going to write to, you know, and it's also going to have probably the information that comes from that game input structure. So in here, you know, we've got some information about the mouse, this sort of stuff. Well, is it? That's probably not true. You know what? I take that back. That's a lie. You know what I probably want to do? I think I want to do that a little bit differently. What I probably want to do there is just provide just the basic mouse information. So probably what I would say is it might not provide any real information there other than the clip space mouse P. The clip space mouse P is probably going to just be the V2, not the V3. The V3 includes Z for mouse wheel. We don't really want the mouse wheel getting passed down here because hit testing is not about the mouse wheel. Hit testing is not about your feelings. It's about the 2D space on the screen where the ray should shoot out from. So when I launch something like an editable hit test, that's the thing we can pass through here. This answers one of our big questions and solves a problem that I think we were having before, which is that when we look into that world mode and we look at what was happening between the world mode and the entity, there's a piece of that wasn't particularly good, right? It wasn't great. And that is here in the update and render entities, you can see that we're passing down that game input structure. Really, the game input structure has no business being here. If you look at what's going on there, it's really just used to get that clip space P and then do some work on it. That's not a really appropriate way to be doing this because remember, past that game input, that's passing a lot of information down. Look at all the stuff it could be using there. It could be using the controller state, the time step. We don't really want to know those things. Why do we not want to know those things? Because look, we don't want to pass information to things that don't need it because they might accidentally use it, right? We don't want to give ourselves the opportunity to make a mistake. I'm not a fan of the weird C++ object-oriented encapsulation nonsense where everyone has to be isolated from everything else, and like everything in your code is some ridiculous, walled-off, incapable little lump, right? That's no good. But I also am not a fan of just having everybody access everything for no reason because I'd rather keep things that should be accessed on the parameter line, so I can see what everyone's using and know. It's kind of a little bit of functional programming, right? It's a little bit of that functional programming idea seeping through, that things that you should be editing should come in as your parameters, right? And the more we pass giant structs that have everything in them, the less we really know what each person's using. It becomes really onerous to pass everything to everybody, so it's not really a good idea all the time. Not to mention it's inefficient in a code sense to always be passing everything as a function parameter, but it is generally true that you want to keep in mind what is going to whom and why, because you don't want things to get too out of control. Anyway, so what I want to do here is I want to go again to that in-game editor, and I want to go ahead and pass in, oops, not that, the hit test that we're doing here, because I want this person to always respond to that hit test if it's appropriate, right? So in this case here, what you can see is we're going to use that hit test. I don't really want to do it. I don't want to do this work unless we actually need it, right? So what I want to do here is say, all right, yeah, the hit test in this case is only going to happen if we actually have one. If we don't have one, then we won't. In here, again, we'll do the same thing. So if we had a hit test, we'll do it. When we record this, we'll see if we had the best hit, we'll push the volume outline, blah, 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 right? This part is a little bit more squirrely, right? It's a little bit less clear what we want to do here. But what you can see is we do probably want this same basic idea. So in this editable hit test here, what we might want to do is have a way of passing down a selection volume like that. So maybe there is a thing here which says like highlight rect, right? And highlight color, something like that. So a way of, in our hit test, also passing back, look, we'd like you to highlight this thing. That's just what we're going to tell you to do. And you're just going to have to trust us on it. Similarly in here, I want to record that probably. So I'd like to say in here, look, this is the highlight rectangle that we're talking about. So this is the rectangle of this thing that we put on here. That also allows me to maybe, if I want to, get rid of the sort key ID. I don't know. I still might want it because I don't know that I really want to do this. We'll see what happens. We'll play that one by ear. So in here, this will change. It's not actually about best hit not equal to F32 max. That's not true. Similarly up here, best hit is not really what we're looking at. Best hit is not going to be used anymore. In fact, it's something that we will probably expand to more of a group search. But basically what it's going to happen here is this thing that we're saving, like hit entity piece and that sort of stuff, that's actually just going to get resolved inside here. So what I'd rather do is say, look, this stuff is going to go in here temporarily. I'm going to work on this a little bit differently. The hit P and the hit dimension, yeah, all that stuff, not really what we're talking about here. I want to just kind of ignore that for now and move it out. So it's really the picking array, that sort of stuff. This stuff, that's what we actually wanted there. And that's going to be doing the picking for this particular routine. When we do the picking now, what we're going to do is this stuff here is going to, when we're doing our push volume outline, that stuff's going to work directly off of the rectangle in question. We're going to pull that out, and we're going to deal with that in 1 second here. But if we have a render group and a hit test, we will want to do our volume outline here. And the volume outline is going to be determined, again, by this in-game editor. And if it wants to do a highlight rect, right? That's what we'd like to do there. Here's what I'll say. Now I think about it, that's dumb. Waste space. We can do it better. Let's roll it in line. We'll have a highlight asset index. It'll go on a 1-frame lag. It'll be fine. We'll say what we want the highlight color to be. And we'll say what the asset is. We won't specify the rectangle, right? Then what we'll do is we'll pull this out. We'll actually put this directly in line here. And we'll say, where was that? Center half dim. There it is. Oops, right there. This will be better. It'll be simpler and more fun and exciting for everybody, really. So in here, what we want to do is when we're going through these, right? When we're going through these, the render groups and doing the hit testing, right? So in here you can see us do the hit test. If we wanted to highlight this thing in particular, then what we'll do is we'll highlight it here, right? So if we have the hit test, I guess I can do it inside this check, like so. We've already pushed the entity transform, so that's fine. I don't recall how, so the hit P, I don't really want. I want the one that's not already offset there. So it's not this one, it's just this one, right? And the dimensions are the same here. That's the one. So I'm going to do all of this in line. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at this T hit radius text box. What I'm going to do here is say, look, if the T hit that I get back, when we look at those, when we wrote our little simple raycaster here, right here it is, doesn't do anything fancy. All I want to do is see whether or not that value that comes back is not equal to the F32 max, right? That's really all I wanted to do. So if it's less than F32 max, then we're going to process the hit. I'm not going to do it this way at all because those are gone, right? Those are going to go in here. I've got my H and my C file swapped. There we go. So what I want to do is every time I get a hit, I want to provide that hit option. So add hit. I want to pass the hit test that I'm using here, which is this one. And I want to pass the hit in question. So here's the world position of that hit. Here's the world radius. What I could do is pass a rectangle here, but I don't really want to. In fact, I guess now I think about it, it doesn't really need that information. So now I think about it, we don't even really need that. I just need the asset index and the sort key. So what I could do here is pass T hit as the sort key. So that's the key we're using for sorting there. The asset index, and you know what I could say? I could just say less is better. So you can pass negative things if you want to. So anyway, when we do our add hit here, I'll go ahead and say, look, any hit is a good hit. To add to the hit system, it can determine whether or not it wants to use those hits or not. That's entirely up to it. And then what we'll do is we'll pass whatever the pieces of information are that are relevant here. Here's a piece index. We also have an entity index. I'd like to make both of those things perhaps... Well, you know, honestly, do I really even care about those? I don't know that I really care. The asset may actually be sufficient because since I can only edit an asset, I may not really care. If I mouse over something, I'll just highlight all the assets on the screen that have that thing. Maybe. That may be a little bit absurd because, like, for example, when you highlight a floor, it'll highlight every floor piece that has that. On the other hand, maybe that's a good thing. I don't really know. Hard to say. Meh. Hard to say. We'll see how it goes. I'll play around with it. We can always add it back in if I don't like it. I'm gonna play that one by ear. So here's what I'm gonna say. Let's start out with a highlight color here. Here's our highlight color. The highlight color is gonna come from that hit test because we have this highlight color. What I'm gonna do is say if I hit, then great. If I don't hit this thing, the highlight color is gonna be multiplied by 0.5f, so it's less. So it'll highlight the entities, the other things that are not under the mouse. It will highlight those as well, but not as much. That basically just gives us a better way of seeing what we're actually going to edit and what we're not going to edit. I think that's a good compromise between the two. I'm going to go ahead and put the highlight color in here. What I want to do here is say, look, I need to know what the asset index actually is. That's actually a little bit of a difficulty here because I get the bitmap ID back. I don't remember to what extent the bitmap ID actually lines up with an asset index. I think it might. I don't know. It's been a long time. Programming is slow on this project because I do it so infrequently. It's just not the first thing on my mind. So let me take a look at what that bitmap ID is actually supposed to be, because I don't really remember. Is it a enum? Is it a struct? I think it's a struct. It's got a particular value. Okay, so basically all of these things, the bitmap ID, sound ID, font ID, they are just asset IDs at heart, right? That's all they actually are. So what I should be able to do here is I should be able to just push the value on there. and say, look, that's the actual thing that I want to be editing. So when we go into a hit here, I'm going to say, here's the asset that got hit. It's whatever this bitmap ID was, this bitmap ID here, right? So that bitmap ID, I'm going to pass that in. Now, I could just let it take a bitmap ID. I'm not going to bother. I'm going to crack it here. But I could pass it in and have 3 of them, one for sounds, one for bitmaps, whatever. I don't know. It's not really a big deal. Anyway, so that's what I'm doing. That's going to add a hit to the system. Then what I'm going to do is I'm also going to see, is that bitmap ID value equal to the one that's supposed to be highlighting, right? So if I come back into the in-game editor, and I just want to know what's the asset index that I'm highlighting here. Like, what do I actually want to show? What does the system think it wants to highlight? If this is that one, then I'm going to push that volume outline on it, right? And if it's not, then I'm not going to. So that gives me a way of integrating the hit testing into the rendering routine very cleanly. It allows us to do one pass and produce the hit test buffer if it was requested at the same time that we do our rendering, and it just simplifies things a lot. There's no baggage being gone on there. It's just a little extra CPU time that's spent in the case where you actually wanted to build it, and you need to spend the CPU time if you're going to build it, right? You can't. There's no such thing as a free lunch, except at vendor-sponsored conferences. So what we want to do here is say, that is how we built it. Now we need to use it, and we need to support this specific function that we're talking about here, where we can add a hit to the system, right? So what I want to do is I want to have a way of adding a hit here. It's going to be crappy and stupid, and I won't really care too much about how it works because, again, it's only something that goes on when the editor, which means it's going to be on machines that people are trying to do actual dev work on, which means they should be okay with things being a little slower if they need to be. So I'm not going to worry about the speed very much here. Here's the asset index that we're going to be editing. And then here on the T hit, I'm going to put in the sort key here like so. And again, like I said, we could make this be a bitmap ID if we want to. I'm not sure if we want to or not, but we definitely could. That's something we could do. We can think about later if we want to add a layer of type checking there in case we think that's important. At the moment, I don't think it is particularly important. When we go ahead and add in hit test, what I'd like to do is make sure that there actually is a hit test because this shouldn't really be getting called because it means you did a bunch of work. I don't want you to be adding hits in that case because it means you did a bunch of work you probably shouldn't have done. So let's take a look at what happens here. If we're looking at one of these editable hit tests, it means we have the destination group in here. That destination group is important. That's the thing we're going to be working on. So here's that editable hit group. Oops, sorry, asset group. I'll call that dest group equals dest group, right? Just pulling it out of here for easier nomenclature. The dest group, I'm going to go through the assets here and look to see if I have one that's, how should I put this? I'm going to look to see whether or not I should prefer this one to other assets in the set, right? Of the things that are being in here. So I'm going to use the sort key to just say, look, we're going to do a few. 16 may have been a bit much. So I think maybe what I'll say is, let's say it's not 16. Maybe it's more like 8, let's say. Furthermore, I could just say that asset count isn't really a thing. Maybe it's just assets and there's just 8 of them and we look through them. I don't know. Or maybe there aren't. I don't know. I'm not sure how I want to do that. So what I'm going to do here is say, let's look through these and compare and find a place to add it. I'll say asset, test index equals 0. Test index is less than the dest group assets. So I'm just keeping 8 of them for now. There's test index. And so what I'd like to do here is just look at each of these editable assets. And I'd like to see whether this one should be replaced or not. In fact, I might call this dest, right? So we'll look at this particular one and we'll say, all right, if this particular destination asset, if its sort key is greater than the sort key that we've received, we would like to replace the one that's here with the one that we're getting now, right? So we want to move the rest up, if that makes sense. And so that's the case that would go here. If any other case, we just proceed. So in the case that we go here, then what I'd like to do is do a copy. So I'd like to move everything up and then I would like to insert the 1. So in this case, what I'm going to do is say, I know I'm going to overwrite this, so I'm going to overwrite it with the 1 that I've got, right? So this is just an insertion. And what I'd like to do is just make room for it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, however much the asset count was, that's how many I would have to copy minus the 1 that I'm on, right? So if we look at what we've got here, I've got an array, and I've got from my test index is the one I'm overwriting. So I've got from there, right, excuse me, up to the asset count. Another way to write it would look actually more like this. Start at this one. Right? I want to go from the test index +1, and I want to go upwards all the way till I get to the end of, I don't know why I didn't type that. I want to go to get to the end of the array, right? Another way to say it would be I want to see if I can get to the end of asset count, right? If we do it that way. I still don't know which way I want to really write that, right? I want to go up to there, and I want to push everything there 1 forward. So I want to basically say, all right, the copy index I want to move everything up 1 unit. So it always wants to copy forward. What you can see from here is the problem I'm going to have is as I copy me overwriting the things that I would like to copy, right? Because it's going to look like this. But as I go, I'm always going to be copying. Oops, sorry, that's not what I meant. As I go, I'm always going to be overwriting the thing that I'm going to copy next with the thing that was before it, and that's not going to work. But again, pretty easy to fix, right? You could do something like this. Now, what we want to do is we want to expand this array in the case where we can. So if we had an asset count that's less than the maximum asset count we can have, right? If it's less, I want to add, right? I want to add some space. And so once I do that, this becomes safe because I know that this is always at least 1 or more. So I can always subtract 1 from it and say, I want to start there, I want to go backwards, and I want to end on the one I was going to fill out, right? I want to end on the one I was going to fill out. So now I can just say, look, the copy index always copies from the copy index -1. So I go back until I would have copied the one that I'm actually going to overwrite. I copy that one and I stop, right? At that point, we're pretty much done. This maintains that sorted list by just doing a simple insertion sort on just a few things, right? And pushing them up each time as I go. That's about all there is to it, not a lot more. We'll debug that routine. Typos or slips of the mind are common in these sorts of things. We'll debug that and check the logic later. But that's basically all we need to do for add hit. So then that leaves us with just the notion of the in-game editor to begin with. And we need some way of render or update and render editor, right? And that's something that we're going to have to, that's going to have to process this like hit. And you know what's interesting about it is it really doesn't need this because it's got a pointer in it. So at some level, the hot group that's in here, it just already knows everything that happened because that's what it did. So I don't really know, honestly, if it needs to get past that. I don't necessarily think it really does. So probably more what we'd actually have is something like this. Something like this. And so what's going on here is we're just saying, all right, there's one of these we're going to send back most of the time, not all the time. And what we're going to do is this, by the way, we'll obviously want this. Well, what we want to do here is we're going to create this thing. We're just going to say, all right, obviously this thing points to the hot group. Right, this editable hit test. Oh, no, you know what? It does get sent in and out. So I can do what I was going to do first. Right? Yeah. So never mind. So we can do begin hit test. We can say editable hit test result. Like so. Right, we can do that. We're going to do this. I could return it as well. I just am not sure which one I want to do. You know, maybe you do this. I don't know. So hard to say. So maybe we do something like that. And then in here we say end hit test, right? And we pass it in like that. So I think that's more or less what we'd want to do there. We'd pass in the editable hit test. We'd go, I don't know, maybe. The only thing I don't like about that is we were sort of using the hit test. So the only thing I don't like about that, and you know what, I don't love that. Let me tell you what I like better. I do think I like this better. I think I like this better. I think I like passing the hit test in, and I think I like saying something like this. And maybe we do that, where we basically say, like, look, whether or not you should hit test is actually a separate setting. And you always get one of these that you use, and then sometimes they ask you to test and sometimes they don't. You know what I'm saying? I like that a little bit better. Excuse me. So I think I'm going to go with that. I'm going to say that the result desk group is the hot group, which is exactly what I want there. I'm going to say that the hot group, in this case too, I want to clear it to 0. I want inside my highlight color, I don't know what I'm going to set that to exactly. I'm going to set this to be the clip space mouse P, and we'll play with these a little bit more. Highlight asset index, it's going to be 0. So we're just going to really do some arbitrary stuff here for the begin hit test. In the end hit test call, not going to do anything just yet. You'll see what we do there a little bit later on. And then when we've got our should hit test thing, we're just going to use whether the desk group was in or out. What that means is that when I'm going to come back here real quick, and just when I was doing that if hit test, I'm going to assume we always hit test. So I'm just going to say, look, it's should hit test. Because I'm assuming we always have one of those going on whenever we're in one of these routines, and it's just a question of whether or not it would like us to do the extra processing or not, right? And so that way we can sort of take this out here and make this be something where we can always highlight, regardless of whether or not, regardless of whether or not there is a hit test in progress, we can actually always provide highlighting support, because that might be something that happens even when we're not trying to hit test and not trying to overwrite any of that information. So I think that's what I want here. And that seems fine to me. When we do our end hit test here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, look, inside the in-game editor, I'm going to keep an idea of like what the editing or what the active asset index is. And I'm going to go ahead and preserve that value. So for now, what I'll do is I'll just round trip it always, which is not what I will do eventually. But I'll say active asset index here. And then in here, I'll rewrite it in. So active asset index equals hit test highlight whatever the first one is in the hit. So basically I'll say it's equal to 0 if we had a hit. So if the hit test asset count was greater than 0, because remember we may not have any hits, then the active asset index equals the hit test assets 0 asset index. Right? So that's really what I want to add. That's really what I wanted to do there. And that'll all work just fine, I think. When we go back to handmade.h, and we've got this in-game editor here. Remember, we're going to have to include it. So in here, I'm going to have to say like handmade in-game editor, right? And in here, I should provide these functions. That will be called by everybody. The rest of these, not really. So it's really just these two that people might be calling. The other ones are more specific. And then inside handmade.h, I'll just include that as well, make sure that gets compiled. That should give me the ability to actually put the editor in line now. So what I can do is in this code now, what we can do is say, all right, let's make sure that we begin the hit test as necessary. So inside here, the game state editor, here's that hit test, will allow it to begin the hit test as such. And then what I'll do at the end here is I'll end the hit test and allow the editor to do whatever it is the editor does, right? But we don't care. And so in here, we'll actually let the editor do whatever it wants to do, should it actually feel like it's editing, and provide that hit testing information as well, right? So then that looks relatively clean to me. That all looks like it would flow pretty nicely. And so then what I need to do is, for the people in here who actually know how to use it, I have to pass down the hit test, and that's fine. So then when I go into world mode now, what you can see is update and render world is actually going to get that information passed into it now. So in here, we will essentially have a thing that says, here's the hit test. And that is the thing that will actually get passed down, not the input when we go to the simulation and the rendering the entities and that sort of stuff. Those things will actually, the input will not be the thing that gets passed in, presumably anymore. I can't remember what that was getting used for exactly. We looked this up the other day, and it was a little bit weird. So it's brain input. So I don't know how I feel about that. Either way, the hit test is what comes in here. And that should be better. Take a look here. That is actually... So that's a little bit of a problem because that wants a hit test always, like I was saying. And in this case, simulate wants to not do any hit testing at all. That seems fine, actually. So actually, though, what I can do is just pass a null one. Which is also totally valid. That seems good. What's the problem here? Editable hit test does not have an overloaded operator. You're right about that. I do not disagree. And this will pick out just the XY. And then in here we've got our test group. So basically in here, this is the thing that would have that in it. And so what I can do here is also say, like, this is a should hit test call. So really what I want to do is say, hey, look, if this thing was a hit testing, then we'll if this thing was in hit testing mode, then we'll update. If it wasn't, then we won't do that, right? So that's good. And then I think we're done. So now hit testing should be happening in line pretty much all the time. And so now we should go in and make sure this stuff works. One thing that's a little messed up, actually you can see it sort of happening right now, is that I think asset index 0 is used for entities that is also used for entities that just don't have any bitmap IDs on them. So I kind of need to have a way of not allowing that to be a valid hit. You know what I'm saying? So like in here, we would sort of have to do like this. All right. So now what I want to do is make sure that we can actually get that picking, and it doesn't look like it's quite going through correctly at the moment. So I want to look at what's going on there. So if the desk group is not equal to 0, we're going to update, excuse me, to be whatever the first asset is. Oh, duh. So in here, we never allow ourselves to append, which we kind of want to do. So what we'd like to do is, yeah, this loop is not really done yet. So what we do want to do here is say something more like, well, in this case, we break, right? And if we didn't add, so, you know, something like added equals false, right? If we didn't add it, and we could have added it, then we want to just append it. And there's probably a better way to write this loop. It looks a little messy right now. So I feel like we probably could do a better job with that. But basically, this is all I'm saying. So like, yeah, if we didn't add one, then, and there was room, we need to add one, right? So that way we can continue to stack them up. You know what I mean? So now, as you can see, we can pick anything that we want to, and anything that shares that asset ID will get highlighted because we're editing all of that. Now, you can see we highlight the actual one that you're on, and we also highlight all the other ones. Maybe a little too much, right? So maybe we want to change that to something much more, I don't know, much dimmer, right? So you can kind of see like it highlights them very, very faintly. Or maybe we don't want to highlight them at all. I don't know, right? It's hard to say. Yeah, I don't really know how to, I don't really know what we want to do with this. We'll see. Because, yeah, it's sort of an open question. I'm not sure which we want to do there. Yeah, sorry. I just don't know. So anyway, what I'd like to do, excuse me, is play with this a little more now. So let's suppose I want to do something where I'm going to show the bitmap assets that we actually have listed in here. And, you know, we did some nice work here with the HHA edit stuff where we can dump an asset, and we wrote some code that like kind of like does a good job of dumping out what's going on. It shows asset names and where they came from and which sprite sheet and all that stuff. So what I'd like to do is, and the errors, remember I wanted to keep the errors there too. So I'd like to be able to get all that stuff out into the actual game as well, where it can sort of print out everything that we had, and then allow us to edit those things in some way, right? Allow us to make some sense of it, right? And I don't have a really good plan for that, so I'm just going to sketch out some stuff and then start implementing it, right? Because we have the ability to do that now, so I'm just going to do it. So in the in-game editor, what I'd like to do, so let's do a couple things here. Let's just say, first of all, you know, we want the ability to have a mode probably in the editor. So there's like an edit mode where we're not editing. There's an edit mode where we're like, you know, asset picking or something. I don't know. I mean, you know what? I'm not even going to fill these in. I'm just going to say, well, we know there's going to be some modes, right? And I'll just call it editing for now, because all I really want is Boolean, but we'll probably expand that notion out a little bit more. So in here, I'm going to say like mode, and that's the mode that we're in. And then we got like what we're editing is listed here. And I'm going to say, that like probably there's just a keyboard shortcut or something that does this, because there is, I don't know. And I would like that to be something that's like toggleable and whatnot. So we run pretty quickly into some issues here that we're going to have. These are very centralized issues that that you have really in any situation. Once we introduce an editor layer, we're going to have to be careful to make sure that when we do things in the editor, they can prevent further action from being taken downstream in the game. And the reason for this is, let's suppose that we want to be able to type in a value, like we want to be able to type in 1.0 or something. Well, if the 1 or the period or the 0 key or something, or let's just say we want to type in a name like what, W-H-A-T. The W key is a movement key, and the hero would start hopping around, right? So we want to make sure that we have ways of differentiating those. So that's another reason for this. We'll probably tie in this editor mode. We'll tie that into our input processing loop so that input processing is suppressed when we are editing. All right. So I'm going to go into the edit mode here, and I'm going to say that when we do begin hit test, I'm going to say that if the editor mode equals edit mode, you know, editing, then it will fill out the hit test, and if not, then it won't. And so that way what will happen is, right off the bat in that situation, because it's initialized to 0, the editor will by default not be picking things, right? So what I'd like to do is then add a toggle so we can get in and out of that mode as necessary. What we can do there is, when we're in our begin hit test call, we can take a look at the input, and the game input, right here, there we go. Inside the game input, we have information that we can use here. F key pressed basically lets us know which one of these things is going down or up. So what we could do here is say, look, if the input F key pressed for, you know, let's say I'm going to use F9, I don't know. So let's say I say we've got F key pressed 9. That's going to put me into my edit mode. Or maybe that's going to take me out of it. Maybe let's do it this way. So I'll just look at these F key presses here. So if I'm in my edit mode or not, I can just toggle between them with an F key press. So when I'm actually, and now that I look at it, I'm not thrilled with it. I think maybe F1 and F2 might be better. I think those were locked to other things, but I kind of like the idea of oops. It should probably be on the left hand, because if I'm using the mouse, I don't want to go all the way over to F9 and F10 really, but we'll see. We'll see how we go with that. So there's edit mode on and off. And I may have some more edit modes that I want to put in there, right? So there's my edit mode. It's all good. And now we'll go ahead and actually put in some display. So like I said, don't really know what kind of editing we're really going to be doing here exactly, but so let's say that this, I guess we kind of do know here we're like editing bitmaps, right? So we're editing bitmaps in this case. What that means is when the end hit test comes on, I kind of want to do something like we do in the debug UI. So in here where we've kind of got this, we've got these notions of text stops and all this sort of thing, right? What I want to do is something very similar to that. So when we go ahead and do our like debug sort of setup there, and we kind of give ourselves a drawing surface, we really just want to do that. So in here where we set everything up, right, and we do our debug in it, that's really what we want to be doing. So we want our debug init where we do like the width and height and that sort of stuff, right? We want our debug stuff to follow this rule. And so in order to do that, we need to create a render group. And to create a render group, we just need to call begin and clear out the depth buffer so that we don't have any depth fighting with stuff that's underneath what we're trying to draw. So I'm just going to have a function here called like render editor, or update and render editor, something like that. So inside end hit test, we're going to call out to that. And that's going to take our editor, and it's going to do render group. It's going to need the game render commands, probably the assets as well, in order to draw from the font, because it needs that information, right? It needs to know which kind of font is going there. I don't remember push font, to be honest with you. I don't really remember what that does. That's like one of those things that you're just like, all right, I'm sure that does something cool, but I have no idea what it was, even though I wrote it. Still don't know. And so, you know what, maybe from here too, I could make this be something that's called from outside, right? So update and render editor could get these things. That's pretty straightforward. Yeah. So if I'm going to do that, I need to make a camera transform that gives me what I want, which I think is basically this. So I can basically say, look, give me a camera transform. We'll say render group here. Give me a camera transform that's just going to be an orthographic projection with no clipping to speak of, really. And that's what we're going to draw to. And then I should be able to just dump text down into there. And I think inside the text op stuff, I'm not really sure to what extent the debug state is really necessary. I think it just gets the font from those things, And so I think we could expand this text op to be something we can use pretty much anywhere that we want to. And that might be good. so it can get the size too. So this seems good to me, you know? So I think we'll maybe make this into a more general routine, right? We'll make this into a routine that can be used anywhere, and that maybe uses the render group more, if that makes sense. Somebody tell me what push font is, because I have no idea. So, okay, so what push font does is it just makes sure that the font is loaded. I mean, that's all it does. It doesn't do nothing else. That is not what I was looking for. There we go. So what does it actually load? It just loads the like glyph and Unicode map. That's it. Right. It doesn't load the bitmap IDs. So, you know, I would say, to be honest, that was not probably a very good idea. So, you know, I'm not going to change it right now, but you really don't need to do that. Like, for a game, we can just keep the font tables in memory. So I think those could have just been in the HHAs as permanently loaded data that doesn't need to get loaded delayed, because they just don't take up that much room. The number, we're not going to have very many fonts. You know, there's going to be like 10 fonts in the whole game tops or something. So you're talking about like, you know, 200K or 300K of data or something like this. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to have gone through that extra effort. So that was probably dumb and didn't really need to happen. You know what I'm saying to you? So, oh well. You know, don't know why we made that decision, but we know we could find out why, because we can go back to the Handmade Hero archives and look, but I don't know why, because I forgot. So anyway, let's go ahead and keep going, and we can get the font stuff straightened out. So inside our debug UI stuff, like I was saying, you know, we've got the font and font info stuff here, and we can go ahead and do exactly the same thing inside the in-game editor, right? So that we get our font stuff straightened out. That font stuff is, I assume, just, yeah, like pretty basic, like loaded font, an HHA font. So we can get those two pretty easily. I think that's all good. Render groups, when you call begin render group, I don't actually remember. Does that return it though wholesale to you? Begin render group. Yeah, that's what I thought. So it should really look like that. More like that. And as far as font ID is concerned, I don't really know exactly how we get the font ID for the debug system in the first place. Let's take a look. So we just do it this way. So we look for a debug font, and the same would probably be true here, right? And so we could do this on initialization as well, and we probably will in the future. For right now, I'm going to leave it like that, and we'll get the font ID here. So this would give us the ability to start rendering text just fine. And so, let me just compile to get rid of the bugs here, the typos and such. So we need to specify the width size. That can come straight out of the commands though, probably, right? So we have our window width and window height right here. And that's presumably all we actually need. So I'm just going to say that the width and height of this system come from the commands window width and window height. That may be about it. What I do need to do is call this, because no one will be calling it. So at the end of Handmade, where I finish the hit test, at some point here we need to update and render the editor, which I guess I can do here. And that provides us an easy way to do it, because we are slipstreaming the render commands here, and that's pretty straightforward. We also know that we do have the game assets in tow, because those would have had to be initialized right up here. So we can pass those as well. So everything's in a good position at this point in the code to ask the renderer to render. So now what we need to do is actually try to have a way to leverage our existing display code so we don't have to write it all multiple times. That shouldn't be too hard either. So, okay, again, we get back to where we were, so you can see we're just kind of doing our thing here, and that's all fine. So now what I want to do is make a way of displaying that information. If I go over to the debug UI stuff and I look at that text up, again, I think these are the sorts of calls that I want to be able to make here. What you can see from them is that they take the debug state, and that's really the thing that would prevent me from being able to use them. The rest of stuff like draw and size text I could just use exactly as is. And so really it's this debug state that would cause the problem. What I can look at here in doing is making this into a more generic piece of code that can be used so that I don't have to worry as much about that, right? Some of the other things here even probably could be used as well. Like just looking at these sorts of things here, right? You can see like a lot of these things are things that I might want to use. Tooltips, for example. So I kind of feel like this debug UI thing, and the layouts as well, it feels to me like this probably just wants to actually be moved into something that can be used without the debug system, right? So I think really we can lean on a lot of this code. I think a lot of this code we can just kind of like clean up and package into sort of a generic like UI displaying thing, and we don't really have to rewrite it. It looks like we've got all the stuff here that we would want. And so what we want to do is take it out of the debug system so that you don't have to be using it for the express purpose of debugging, so that it can be used for an in-game editing operation that's supposed to ship with the game and not necessarily compile out. But who knows, these things may kind of merge slowly over time too. It's hard to say because we may want to ship with something, but we fundamentally don't want the debug system to have to run at runtime because it's too slow. So we do kind of want to make a little bit of a distinction between those two things, right? So I think I'm going to keep that going for now. I would like to know why I feel like is hex could be something that's kind of in the generic library that we've got here. You know, we've got a bunch of stuff here for that sort of thing. And I do kind of feel like, you know, there's really no reason not to have that be in here. You know, we've got is white space, so why not an is hex, right? So I think an is hex would be totally reasonable. I think a get hex would be totally reasonable to put in here as well. So, right, those seem really straightforward. I feel like get hex would maybe already have existed too, like so I guess we didn't have a hex one. Maybe that's the only one. So that's fine, I guess, you know. Totally fine. Well, let's keep moving forward. So I'm going to look at the debug UI stuff and maybe, like I said, pull that out into just generic UI. So we might not call this debug UI anymore. Let's take a look at debug interaction. I want to understand that a little bit better because that may want to move into the debug system only. Not sure. It's pretty hard to determine. But this stuff you can see, so other than the fact that it has the debug state in it, this layout stuff is otherwise pretty, you know, pretty not that, for lack of a better term. It allows us mostly to, it looks like it allows us mostly to just program it the way we would want. Let me try putting this in to sort of a handmade UI or handmade, well, you know, handmade debug UI is not a bad name for it because it kind of is for that. But I feel like maybe handmade developer UI is better because it's not necessarily for debugging, but it's only for editing. I don't know. It's a really hard call. But let's take a look and see what would happen if we were to sort of make these things a little bit more generic. So I'm going to look at interactions are equal. And I want to see where that's getting called. Interaction is hot. So here's an end element call, right? And you can see it's using this interaction thing to see whether or not it's something that should be interacted with in the debug state. But, you know, again, that interaction could be made very generic. So yeah, I'm just not sure where I want to break this code off. Because one way to do it is to just use the drawing bits. And so I'm just not sure whether, you know, which of those I want to do. Do I just want to do the drawing bits? Or would I rather... And I'm not sure. What I want to do on this side of the code might be instructive to look at. So maybe I want to do something, excuse me, and say, look, if the editor mode is not equal to none, right? So if we're going to be doing some editing, I'll do this stuff. And then I'm going to look and see, well, what mode am I actually in? And if I'm in the bitmap editing mode, then I'll do like some kind of call here, like, or like, you know, bitmap editor. I don't know. You know what I mean? And so in here, what I want to do is say, well, there's a bitmap editor, right? And so the bitmap editor wants to do some stuff with the information that it has accessible to it, right? So it wants to be able to say something like, I know I've got an active asset index, so I would like to display the information about that particular asset, right? Which we kind of know what that looks like because we know it looks like this. So I probably want to do something like this. Well, I guess, we could just have that be in line with it, right? It could be something more like this. Where's that setting? There it is. So if we're in the asset edit mode, then we want to basically do something like this, right? And so in here, when we're in the asset editor, we want to be able to print this out, right? And in here, there should be something which lets us sort of do each of these individual things. So in handmade asset.h, I need to be able to get one of these assets, excuse me, out. So I want to be able to get, an asset. So I want to be able to say asset equals, get asset from the asset system. And I know that the one that I'm looking at is like the active asset index, right? So I want to be able to get that out. I probably need to say something like, if the active asset index is not equal to 0. You know what I mean? I could also do it more like this, right? And I'm not sure, exactly what that'll look like, but we'll look at that in a second. So then in here, we know we've got a couple different things. So we know we've got the HHA asset, and that's going to be equal to the asset HHA thing. And I might just call that HHA for now. We know we've got the annotation. So I've got those two pieces of information here. We've got a header. I don't know that I care about the header much. And we've got kind of the file index stuff. What I can do is pull the file out. So, I can also grab the file that, that it came from because I know that as well. Like so. And that gives me, I think, most of the things that we would be looking at here as I go. So in this case, I then want to more or less do this. You know what I mean? I want to be able to I want to be able to put all this information in there, right? So I want to do something like, all right, all of the, it's like a piece of lint floating by me. I want to be able to put the errors in there. I want to be able to put the tags in there. I don't care about this because that's just a global tag list. So yeah. So I want to just be able to put all this stuff in there. Now, the HHA annotation stuff, I don't actually load any of that information in. The annotation part is not saved, if I remember correctly. So, we would have to issue file reads to get that information. And so at the moment, I feel like the way we would get that is probably also by having the loaded asset thing. So meaning we would kind of need... we would kind of need that load as well. Like we would need this same concept in here. This thing would need to exist in both places. And I could literally just copy it out. Which I might want to do. Yeah, I think I do want to do that. And then we can do is we can lazily load those potentially. So we don't actually load them in normally, but if someone starts editing, we would be, I guess, the way that I would put that. So the loaded HHA annotation is just like, well, you know, that's what happens if you load one of these in. Like so. And so, you know, we would do something like this. So I can call the asset system and say, hey, I need the annotation for this thing because I'm an editor and I need that sort of thing. So you need to give me that, right? And off we go. So once I do that, and this could be like marked as such, so you know that these are not calls that like are supposed to be happening in the normal course of gameplay. They're just things that are supposed to be happening when an editor kicks in, right? Which is legal in the release mode. It's just not performance-oriented, tested, well, whatever. Like it's like kind of this like fringe thing that only a developer is going to be using potentially, right? So I think that's what we would like to do here. That is what makes sense to me. Anyway. Yeah. So then I just want to dump everything, right? I want a way to like dump everything. And so I want to do like, you know, something like this. So I want to do something like I can do a begin section sort of thing. And I want to be able to put some information probably on that line. Something, this section would be like, so what I kind of want to do here is say like, look, it's sort of an if sort of thing. So I want to kind of do a thing where I'm like, look, this is a section, and maybe I have two ways of printing this out. So, you know, there's a section that shows you all of the data about the asset or something, like asset layout or something like that. And if you do or don't get it, you might print out things differently. That's all I was thinking. So what I want to show here is I want to show like in the actual asset thing, I want to show like a bunch of this stuff. So I want to like, I want to show like the state. I want to show the file index. And I want to show like the asset index in that file. right? Like I kind of want that layout stuff to be available so that we can know, like especially if we have to debug stuff that we're editing, we can know like what that is. I'm gonna put in here just the global asset index, like so. Something like that. So that we can see these things. And maybe I want these to sort of be a little bit more squinky. I need to think about these a little bit more. I need to like think about these a little bit more. Don't quote me on this because that's probably not what I actually want. So we're gonna play with this a little bit more. But then once we get to the asset itself, the actual like information, and you know, the other thing I probably want to do is like if begin section like asset file, something like that, and maybe this kind of makes a little bit more sense. Over here too. I'm sorry I'm not describing what's in my head very well. Basically what I'm thinking is how I want these things to be output. Because I kind of want them to maybe be sort of more similar to a printf in that way. And it's hard to decide which way I actually want that to go, right? And so it's hard to think through exactly what I want to have happen here, and I'm in my head kind of weighing some different options. And I really should be talking about them out loud so that you can hear them. What I want to do is make the easiest possible way to describe this data so that I can see it, and also for the ones that are editable, edit it. There aren't that many that are editable, so I'm thinking like this is probably a waste of everyone's time because you can't really edit any of these U32s, and you're never going to be able to, right? So I don't really think I really need that, actually. So I think it should probably be more like something like this, where we say, okay, you know, there's going to be like like an expandable or collapsible section, probably. And maybe that thing sort of tells us some information about the asset itself. Like something like that, you know, and in there we're just saying, look, all right, you know, we've got this this sort of set of things that we're going to pass down to you, and what we're going to do is we're going to have certain ones of those be editable potentially, but most of the time they're just going to be output as individual strings that just get displayed. You know what I mean? It's just, again, I'm really having a hard time seeing that far in the future, so it's hard for me to even type in what I actually want, because we're going to have to kind of get down there a little bit more to see it. But let's focus on what we actually need first. So I've got these bitmaps here, right? And so in there, these are the things that I actually want to do. This reserved is probably going to be a scaling value, I would say. Although I think we actually decided that goes into the align point itself. So the scaling values are actually in the align points, not in here. So that's fine. This might, in the future, though, have a source size that actually, like the original size, I think that might be... because we may need that. All right, so basically this is the main thing that we're trying to edit, right? is the Hha Align Point. And so let's focus on that, right? So we know we've got some number of align points. So we want to have a little thing that lets us edit those somehow, right? So we want to do a thing here that's like, you know, begin section, alignment points. You know, we're going to do something like this. And, you know, we're going to have a layout here or whatever. And what we want to do is go through all the alignment points that we have, right? And for each one of those align points, provide the data and also a way to edit that data, right? So if this is the point, then I've got a couple different pieces of data here. I've got p% size and type. I want to be able to edit all of those, right? So inside the file formats there, I believe we've got ways each of these, and I want to be able to edit all of them, right? So I actually want to be able to do the parent thing. I want to be able to do the type. I want to be able to do the p%. I guess we'll just continue calling that. And then we also want the size. So I want to get all of those, and I want all of them to be editable. Furthermore, at the end, if the I really probably want this to be out here, and I want this to be a while loop that does this. And each time through the while loop, I want to check to see for every one of these points whether it actually is valid or not, right? So each one of these points, I'm going to have a thing where, you know, we've got align points in here and whatever. I want to have a thing that for each of the align points, I assume, honestly, I guess I don't even know. I assume we want these to be like, if we delete one from the middle of the array, we want to collapse the array. I assume, but honestly, we don't really have to do that because we could just choose to like display the 12 points and you delete the one you want and there's just 12 slots because that's actually what's going on. So I guess I might say we're just, maybe I take it back. Maybe we're just going to do it like that. So in here, what I want to do now is I want to like have these things be like, I want to be able to have these things be editable. So there's like an attaches to parent Boolean here. You know what I mean? And, you know, if that gets toggled, I'm going to do something with it, right? I've got like a size here. That size has bounds that have to be respected. So we know that like we don't want it to we don't want you to be changing it too willy-nilly, so, well, I guess I'll leave that for a little bit later. We've got a type. And the types are a little bit harder because they allow you to select, in order to select from a type, you kind of need the list of what are the things that the type represents. And I'm not sure the best way to do that exactly in this case. However, we may be able to get away with something fairly straightforward by just saying, well, here's the set of align points that the code understands, right? And we can easily translate to and fro. So in some sense, we could say it's easy to pass what the thing was because we can always say align point name from type, right? Like that. The hard part is inside this routine, it's going to be pretty hard for it to know what the things are that you are actually editing. We can do some tomfoolery here. We can do a thing that does tell it. I don't know that we really want to. So I may just leave it at that for now, and we may have a crappy editor for this. I can show you how to make a better one sometime if people really want to. Hard to say. So let's go ahead and create the editable percentage stuff here. So in here what we want to do is we want to be able to edit all of these things. So we want to be able to edit both the X and Y as well. And we kind of want that to be an editable XY position sort of thing. We'll have to specify the bounds here probably as well. And I don't know exactly how we want to do that, but it's probably something like this. And the same is probably true here. Like, I don't really want things to be too small, and I don't really want things to be too large or whatever, right? So I'm just specifying a range so that it kind of knows what the scale is. Sizes may just not need that because sizes are generally best edited. I'm going to get rid of that. Sizes are generally edited best to fit a relative motion. So I think that, unlike positions, which are absolute kind of motions. So I think that's probably how we would want that to work out. So this would allow us to express what needed to get edited as far as the things we actually cared about with the alignment points and such. And if any of them actually get set, then what we can do is call the corresponding function inside the asset system file format stuff to actually set that stuff back, right? And so what we want to do here is like set the alignment point based on whether these things happen. Now, I don't know that we need to put that inside each of these, but I want to make sure each of them gets called. So I think what I'm going to do is just do like an edited thing, and just have that be false, and then in each of these things, I'll set it to true. And there's ways we could do that are better. And you know what? I'm just going to do them. I'm going to do something like this. So in here, we basically like, let's begin an edit block. I'm going to specify what the editable things are. Here they are. So do this, and then do if end edit block, then do that. So that way we have a clean way of saying these things get edited together if they were edited in some way. Then it's a good time for us to say, let's set everything on our point. And by the way, we'll have to have an ability to flush back to the HHA now as well, right? I think that's really mostly what I want to do. I wanted to have a way of specifying the error stream here. So I, again, want to be able to load that and print out some more of these things, but I'm not sure I really care about the rest of them. So yeah. What I do want to do is move this into the bitmap side of things. So I want to put that in here, right? And then other stuff that gets edited, we don't really have any need for font editing and so on. Right. So, you know, if I look at what I actually need for editing, the things I actually wanted to edit, they're actually pretty minimal. So I could really just focus on doing this and not care too much to get carried away with the other stuff that might be nice to have but isn't super relevant at the moment. We really would just need this. And then when you actually edit one of these, we will need a way to save it back. And so we'll need a way to sort of say, look, this stuff kind of has to be marked as dirty, and later we'll save it. And we may want to do like the ability to revert or undo as well, because we may not want to save the changes. So although we want to always set the align point whenever you make a change, we don't actually want to allow you to make changes to the file directly. We want to just do them in memory like we're doing here, and then we'll have a way to flush them to disk after the fact. So yeah, I think really this doesn't have to happen at the moment, and I think we can just do it like this and focus on that. And we'll see. And we can expand it to be better later, but at the moment, that may be the more reasonable thing. Right? So if we were to come through here, then what we would need, we need to have a way to make this a layout thing actually do something. And, you know, to be clear, it would look more like this, right? Because it's going to have actual stuff in it. But that's mostly what we're talking about. And I think really what's going to happen here is that each of these points too would really be specified like this can just be one line of data, right? It can just be one line on the screen, and I would like it to sort of collapse that up, right, into like just a thing that it shows a single line of. And so, you know, I kind of want to say something like, you know, begin line, end line, and this would be something like you know, I want to be able to say this is the nth one of these. You know what I mean? That's more or less what I want to do. You know? And there are some other ways I could do that, and I'm not sure which one of those would be the best, but it's more or less that, where I basically just have, let's make a line. It should have this stuff on it. And if, I think I also here want to say, you know, if this point is like a non-point, so the type is null, it's where are you? Line point, there it is. So if we're talking about this, if it's just none, right? Then I kind of just want a like a button that just says add point, right? Or maybe that. So it just lists the ones that are unused, and you can click on one and it would add it. So if in this case you did, it would just create a default alignment point there. So it would do like a set alignment point. And it would say like, all right, by default, then we just say like, you know, it doesn't go to the parent, the size is 1.0, and the p% is like 0.5.5. So if you create a new point, it just creates that. And then you can do whatever you want with it after that, right? So I think that's fine, right? So off we go. We build a line of crap here. We put these editable things in there. And that gives us all of the, like, if we implemented that, it would give us everything that we wanted. We do need some way of deleting it. So I think we also want to be able to put here a way to like delete, right? So we want to have a button that deletes it. And if we were going to delete it, then what we would do is say, okay, like set the type to be none, right? And that seems fair, right? That seems like a pretty easy way to construct the interface that we would need for this set of things to work. And I don't know, like, there's two ways we could have done this, and I'm not sure which one we really want, because they're pretty different. So one way is that you actually just stuff everything into the format function, and the other way is this. So to show you what I mean, it'd be like, more like this. So like, something more like this. So you'd basically do like, okay, you know, this thing is gonna have two branches here. One of which is Hha Align None. And in that case, you're just going to have one button, which is like the unused thing. And the other way is you're going to have this. And either way, they're going to have a \n at the end. And maybe both cases, they've got the number, right? And it's just, that's the line, right? If that makes sense. And I could still do it the other way. So, you know, you could still do it this way. It's really up to you which one you want. And so it would basically look like everything stuffed behind a printf. The printf looks like this. In these two cases, we do these two things. And then what you do is you wrap your values in things that create little structs on the stack that tell the system what each thing should be. So this all gets stuffed into one thing, right? That looks like this, where you just have like you know what I'm saying to you? Does anyone know what I'm talking about here? Right? And there's advantages and disadvantages to each of them. In this case, the problem is you end up in things where you have to create synthetic variables to record results, such as if you want the button here, you can't just do if button delete. You have to do like delete, like here's the thing to edit, right? And I don't know which one of them, you know, you would prefer I implement. It's 6 1/2 dozen of the other. It's both of them are problems with the way that C and C++ work. Neither is particularly good language for these sorts of operations. There's a lot of limitations to it, and that's just kind of the way it goes. But you know, you can sort of see how they would shake out, and you know where you might like or not like stuff in either case, right? So this is what they would both look like, and yeah, that's all I got for you. I mean, that's the difference between the two. And one thing you can see about them is they're not that different, right? I mean, they look pretty similar. And it really just comes down to whether you prefer to be able to specify your formatting this way or whether you want to build it up out of calls like this. And I don't have a strong opinion about which one of those two things should happen. There are advantages to each, right? And I don't know. So I think maybe I'll go with the more function-heavy approach for now rather than this one, just because it seems maybe a little more in keeping with how we have tended to do things on Handmade Hero. And so, you know, maybe I'll say this is what we're going to go with. So that'll leave us with a bunch of things. Oops. That'll leave us with a bunch of things that we haven't implemented. And so what we'll have to do here is, I don't know what this is complaining about, asset memory header. So what we'll have to do here is implement these things tomorrow. Like that basically tells us exactly what we're going to be doing. And so we'll do that. And probably using, again, that code that we already sort of had as a way to not have to re-implement those things because they're all pretty much already what we want. And we just need to extend them a little bit, if that makes sense. So I'll go to brief Q&A, and we'll write that stuff tomorrow. Off topic, how do you index large meshes? Would you divide into multiple chunks? Yes. I would divide into multiple chunks. Generally speaking, my experience with GPUs is that you just want to minimize the amount of space things take, you know? So there's like very little chance that you can't break things into chunks of 65,000 vertices, right? I mean, come on. Like, how can you not, right? So I would always break them up into those chunks so that my indices could be smaller. Have I changed my fork to custom since I handed over to Alan? Alan generally keeps it updated so that if you are... what do I want to say? If you're forcoder, if you bought forcoder super or whatever it's called, you just get it. So it should be in the distro, I think. He keeps it up to date. So as he changes the custom layer, he like backports it. And I usually just pull the changes from him. Not really on topic, but how would you go about implementing a generic resizable array? As you said, you don't like to use templates. In my experience, there is no way to implement a generic resizable array in C and C++. Period. It doesn't work. So assuming you want it to be typed, like just forget about it. It doesn't work. Templates are horrible for this. Macros are horrible for this. Void stars are horrible for this. You need a metaprogramming language. Anytime you want a generic anything, you need a metaprogramming language because you want to look at stuff like when the array... I mean, let me show you a very simple example of how bad C and C++ are at this and why you need a metaprogramming language. It's very, very obvious, right? And like, I'm going to say this is always enrages me, so I apologize for the comments I'm about to make about how stupid everyone is, but I'm going to make those comments invariably because I get so angry at C++ because it seems to be specified by people who never even write any code. It drives me insane. And so I end up being very angry about it, which isn't necessarily productive because they never change, so it doesn't matter. I might as well not, but what can I say? So here's what C++ looks like, right? I mean, generally you would do something like this, right? Or that, I think, is their typical way they write it. And they say, you know, here's my thing that I'm going to make, you know, and, you know, I want to put some stuff in it. Of course, they would always write class, even though, you know, I love it. They do this all the time, even though that's just a this. I don't know why, but anyway. So, you know, I want to make one of these things and, you know, it's going to have, an array pointer, sorry. It's going to have an array pointer in here that's like, here's the storage, you know, and then inside here, I'm going to have, you know, like a count or something, you know, and then what I want to do is I want to implement things that let me just like put stuff in whatever the size of the array is. So, you know, I want to have something like an operator, you know, that is going to let me access things in here and something like this, you know, and inside here I'm going to pass an index, right? So I can create some size things, and I want this thing to just work, you know? I just want it to work. So I want to say, when I look at element 16, it's there, and I can write to it. You know what I mean? So in somewhere like here, they would do something like, okay, here's the index, right? I'll return that. But by the way, you know, if the index is out of bounds, then, you know, like allocate and copy or something, right? You know, there's some function in here that'll do that. This is basically what you do, right? So then in here I say, oh, I want one of these things. This is going to be awesome. It's great. And then somebody writes this. Okay. So what are you going to do now? Right? What are you going to do? Well, the language literally gives you no way to do anything about this. It's just over before it starts. This will literally call allocate and copy however many times the grow rule goes for. So people end up doing things like, oh, I'll do like twice the size, right? Like each time or something like this. So I grow by an exponential amount or something like that, right? That means I'll waste all this storage, whatever. It's so clear from this code how many things you needed, right? This is how many I needed in the container. It's obvious, right? So one of the things that you want to do, the obvious piece of code that you would write if you're metaprogramming, right, is you go like, all right, for each place, and I don't know the syntax of this metaprogramming language because they've never given it to me, but for each place, you know, container calls operator blah, you know, get parent, you know, or containing scope, you know, equals get parent scope or whatever, right? While, you know, this, look up through each one. You know, is it a loop? If is loop, okay? You know, get bounds of the loop. Look at the bounds of the loop. If I can see what they are, then allocate that many ahead of time, right? That's what I want, you know, in my language. I want to be able to just write that in there, you know? Look and see what happens in this loop, how many there are. Better yet, you know, give me some way of asking the programmer, right? Maybe I can't see what this is, like it's just like foo. Say like, look, if it's a loop, then like remind programmer, you know, did you reserve space for those? And then print this out for each one of these, and then allow the programmer to say, yes, I did on them, right? And remember which ones they were or something. All of these things would be really good. Instead, what happens is they're just like, no, you know what? You forget it. There's no way to do any of that. So you just end up with this. Every time. And if they forgot to do this, then the code just sucks. You know what I mean? And it's just... the idea behind having generic things is they're only useful if I can actually make them do the right thing that I would have done if I just had written the code the right way in the first place, right? And if you can't do that, then what's the point? This is bad code, right? If this ever runs, your code is bad. There is never a time when this code is good. Ever. Ever, 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 right? Exponential growth is not a good predictor. It's terrible. It either wastes space or wastes time, but it's or both usually, right? So if you want a generic container that I'm supposed to not have to think about using, then you need to actually have, or sorry, not a generic container, a container that grows automatically. It should be smart. It has to look at the code and figure out what's going on, right? And if it can't figure out what's going on, it should throw up a warning. Like, hey, I can't tell. You got to tell me. I don't know what, tell me how many things this loop's going to do, right? Give me that bonus. That's generic programming. That's encoding the logic necessary to create the correct code into the code. What C++ does is it gives you the ability to encode the worst possible crap code to be automatically generated by your compiler. Because it's like, if I wanted to have the dumbest possible intern implement everything that I told them to implement in the worst possible way, that's C++, right? It's the dumbest possible intern running the worst possible code, and that's the only thing you can generate. You can't ever write generic stuff that generates good code that a good programmer would have written, because it doesn't give you the ability to look at the enclosing scopes where things are used, so you can't actually encode the logic that a programmer would have used to do something smart there. And you can't, failing that, you can't even output code that tells you that to please do it for me, right? I can't even output something here that says, oh, don't do this inside this loop this way, right? So like, I don't know what to say, right? And so basically every time someone uses a C++ feature to implement something, what they're effectively doing is saving themselves typing time by putting code into a generic system by accepting worse code than they would have had if they had written it in the place from scratch, right? And that's not what you want in the language. You don't want to have to make that trade-off. I don't want to constantly be thinking, oh, do I want to save myself some programming time by making this into a crappy generic thing that doesn't work very well? Or do I want to spend the extra time to write it correctly? And like, should I defer that decision to later? Like, I just want to be able to write it right. Like, why can't I just write it? Why can't you just give me a language that lets me write it correctly? How hard would that have been? I would argue not very hard. You just need to give people access to the AST, and you need to allow them to ask questions about the structure of the code that they were being called with, right? And I don't think it's fundamentally that hard. It certainly isn't as hard as making a compiler that does all the rest of the crap that's in C++ 17x 11 27 35 Blade Runner 43 or whatever, right? Like, it's definitely not as hard as making that compiler. It's way easier because they've added so much crap on top of crap on top of crap trying to solve problems like these that would have just been solvable if you'd allowed the programmer to have a metaprogrammer, an actual metaprogram, I watched the episodes that you presented pre-multiplied alpha, and I remember you mentioned that you prefer to defer multiplying by alpha at the end. Can you explain what that means? Also, what's the benefit of pre-mult alpha other than the fact that it is a linear operation? If that's the case, I can only see the value if you're compositing multiple transparency layers. Opaque geometry on one layer of transparency doesn't really benefit from it. Am I missing something? You are missing something, but I'm not. In the second half of the question, the first half of the question, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to. Defer multiplying by alpha at the end, I'm not sure what you mean by that because I don't remember the context in which I said it. So I apologize, I can't give you an answer for that. On the reason why you use pre-multiplied alpha, actually you need alpha to be linear everywhere. It's not just for multiple blending operations. And the reason for that is that inside almost every rendering operation, there are linear operations happening whether you like it or not. So for example, bilinear blending, it's got linear right in the name. Every single pixel we draw goes through a bilinear blend. That's how we get scaling to look smooth, is the bilinear blend, right? That bilinear blend will produce an incorrect result if the underlying information is itself not linear, because a bilinear blend blends linearly. If the underlying stuff is not linear, then the bilinear blend will produce a non-linear result. And so even just shrinking a sprite down produces incorrect results if you were using non-premultiplied alpha. So premultiplied alpha is necessary right from the first time you start doing anything, even scaling. Now, because modern hardware is very powerful, you can decide to do other things now. You could use non-premultiplied alpha and write your own blending routines that do things inside them to fix it. But assuming that you're using the hardware bilinear blend, you can't do that. And so to be on the fast path, you typically still want premultiplied alpha, even today. So hopefully that helps answer the question a little bit. And as for whether or not C++ forces you to use templates or not, it doesn't force you to use templates, but if you want to write a generic container, you have to. They don't provide any other features for doing so. So it's like either you don't get a generic container or you have to use templates. They have no other metaprogramming features. I think they're adding introspection somewhere at some point, right? Finally. That was my understanding anyway. And whether or not that goes through a different path or something, I don't know. I don't know how they are going to end up shoehorning that in. But just in terms of generic containers, I would love to write generic containers. C++ just simply doesn't support them to my satisfaction, so I don't bother. But in a proper metaprogramming language, all of my containers would be generic. Is the asset tool fixed from day 470? I wasn't able to build some of the tools coming to build it. Oh, that's a good point. The test asset builder probably needs to get merged in now, which I should probably do. You know, this is something we should probably do soon, so I don't really want to do it tomorrow, but probably next weekend we should merge the font stuff and the sound stuff. We should just move those in for the automatic importing so that you can basically just never have to use this stuff again, right? That would also allow us to stop, you could do a build straight from our source inputs again, which is better, right? That's just a better thing. So we should do that soon. But no, you can't really do that at the moment. All right, that's it for today. All right, thank you everyone for joining me for this episode of Handmade Hero. It's been a pleasure coding with you as always. If you would like to follow along with the series, you can always pre-order the game on handmadehero.org. It comes with the source code, which allows you to follow along at home and play around with the stuff that we're doing. I'll be back here tomorrow when we'll implement that editor stuff by basically taking our debug UI code and just maybe unifying it a bit so that we can use it for edit versus debug and so on. Hope to see you back here for that. Until then, have fun programming, and I'll see you on the internet. Take it easy, everybody.